Hello everyone and welcome to British Music History, where we celebrate the best of British music and shine a spotlight on some of the musical icons of the past century. I've lined up a special interview today to talk all about John Lennon. This year marks what would have been the Beatles songwriter's 80th birthday, whilst also being 40 years since his tragic death. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Kenneth Womack, the author of numerous Beatles books such as Solid State, The Story of Abbey Road and The End of the Beatles. Ken's most recent book, John Lennon, 1980, The Days in the Life, focuses on the final year of John Lennon's life before his assassination in December 1980, an event which tragically cut short the life of a legend who many today still consider to be the voice of a generation. Welcome, Kenneth. Thank you for joining me for this interview today.
Oh, thanks so much, Luke. It's good to hear and see you virtually.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, everything's virtual nowadays, isn't it? What we've locked down, so it's good to put a face to the name. So
we'll meet again.
Yeah. Firstly, I want to congratulate you on this new book of yours. I've read it, and I've lost count of the amount of books about John Lennon that I've read. There's so many on the market, but what I will say is yours is one of the best that I've read that purely focuses on that final year of his life. What was it about that particular topic that set you out on that path to actually writing it and researching it?
Well, it was exactly the same kind of feeling you, I think, expressed just now, which is that there are a lot of, first of all, there are many, many, many books on John Lennon. And of course, in several instances, people have, I think, made really important contributions. And, I try to cite those folks as often as possible in my book. But there are a number of them, too, that focus purely on salacious aspects of that year, or perhaps just tell his story without going into the place where folks like us discuss the music. And it was John Lennon's own words that I think about a lot, where he said, years from now, the only thing that will matter is the music. And I believe he's correct, and he was correct when he said that back then, often in response to folks wanting the Beatles to get back together, and John would just sort of tell it like it is. And it is the music that matters, and trying to understand its creation and to bring that period back to life. That's exactly what drew me to the story. I felt like we needed that book.
Yeah, definitely. And like I say, it's an excellent read, because you obviously do talk about the period before that final year, but it's so seamless. You obviously start in 1980, or the new year, as he sees that new year initially. And, it then goes back into a lot of what he went through in terms of purchasing the Dakota. There's lots of really fascinating bits of information that I hadn't come across elsewhere. So, it's the sort of book that I definitely would recommend for people who just want an insight into the man, and certainly how he'd changed. I mean, my next question is a little bit of speculation. It's a question that everyone is asking themselves in his what would have been his 80th year. There is a bit that you put in your book where you quote John as envisioning himself as an 80-year-old sitting in a rocking chair, waiting for postcards from his son Sean, which is a really touching sentiment given what happened. In this time, so in this year that would have seen him celebrate that 80th birthday he referred to, what is your personal opinion on how you think that John Lennon's career might have gone had he not passed?
Well, obviously that is really difficult speculation to even undertake, because, by this point he might have passed from any number of natural causes. But I try to look for the evidence that we can think meaningfully about. So, as the week after he died, he was scheduled to go to the West Coast in support of a union rally. I believe that he and Yoko would never have ceased carrying out those sorts of activities. I think they would have continued together, and she has, of course, done this by herself or with her son Sean. They would have continued to support meaningful causes, fighting for the underdog, etc. I think, though, also another piece of evidence I like to think about is what happened with David Bowie. And I don't mean his death. What I mean rather is, the advent of the internet, and this is probably true for lots of human beings. It is true for lots of human beings, but it really consumed him for a while. I think John Lennon would have been fascinated by the ability to communicate instantly and get a response instantly from people virtually anywhere. And I like to think, and again, it's, brash speculation, but I like to think and believe that he would have enjoyed the reach of the internet and perhaps have been, a kind of bright light, or at least a guiding voice in that world.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's another bit in your book. It's interesting you should mention the David Bowie thing, actually. In your book, it describes him watching Ashes to Ashes, the music video, where he admits that's what I should be doing. And that in itself, led me to speculate how he might have fared in that MTV generation. I mean, David Bowie famously described those years as his Phil Collins period, where after Let's Dance, he was everywhere, and all of that kind of thing. The mind boggles at what Lennon might have gone on to do if he'd have been able to really cut his teeth in terms of producing music videos in that time frame. I want to just sort of dial back to the actual album that he was working on in 1980, which was released 1 month before his death, which of course was Double Fantasy. And then obviously later, the posthumous release, which used some of the songs from those sessions. I'd argue actually that Lennon's songwriting at this time was very much at the top of his game. But I think that unfortunately the reception of that album is somewhat marred by the fact that because he passed, sales of that record increased, and it's difficult to know for sure whether that album would have done as well as it did had it not been for the tragic event that occurred. Do you think that the album would have been as successful had it not been for Lennon's untimely demise?
I would hazard a guess, and I'll explain it, that I think it might have been more successful because, of course, the thing was out barely 3 weeks when he was murdered. And it had an immediate before and after effect, as all of those events in the latter part of 1980 did. You could not separate listening to that album from your heartbreak, right? So watching The Wheels or Woman or Starting Over immediately take on these very different kind of tones. Even the Yoko songs, right?
Yeah.
You realize that this was a couple torn asunder by murder, and it just was heartbreaking. The release of Walking on Thin Ice was deeply marred by what had happened on December 8th. I've been thinking a lot about this lately, about the fact that amazing recording we never got to enjoy, or at least receive, without that terrible cloud, right? And I think this is true for the record. So, if we're going to play hypothetically for a moment, and he's not murdered, it was certainly getting some mixed reviews. But John and Yoko had sown the seeds of several print and media interviews, so they had a nice kind of buzz they were building. And I imagine two things would have worked to really serve that record well, and they would have served that record well in a really crowded field. Think back to the fall of 1980. My God, everybody has something out. There are genres fighting for the top spot. You've got juggernauts like Blondie and new wave artists like the Cars, and then you've got all of the dinosaurs. We weren't even calling them dinosaurs yet, right? Like Paul McCartney and Supertramp, and all of these. Dylan had a hit during that period, amazingly enough. So it was a very crowded field. Queen was lording over the charts. Pink Floyd, I think, was #1 for a good half of 1980 with The Wall. So it was a very crowded field. The two things, though, that would have, I think, helped him were, one, the cover of Rolling Stone, which he and Yoko had, I think, very smartly posed for on December 8th. That cover never got to do its work on behalf of the album because, again, when we saw it, weeks later after the murder, all we could think about was, wow, this guy we loved is dead. Instead, it would have had, a jolt inside of the cultural zeitgeist, and I think they could have gotten many, if not a million units out of that, right? It was the old John and Yoko sort of revealing themselves, pun intended, to us. And then the magic bullet at that time for acts who were, say, of an earlier generation, or at least had, blossomed a decade earlier, as John Lennon and the Beatles had. The Magic Bullet was going on tour, and he had deep plans, as so many witnesses have pointed out, to go on a 1981 tour. That was the way that most acts created success in those days. Look at Paul McCartney. Back to comes out. It's it gets to number 7 or so on the charts. It's a weak showing for Paul McCartney and Wings in 1979. What does he do? He goes on tour. To push more units, to work hard on his new Columbia contract, by the way. So I think that a John Lennon and Yoko Ono tour would have created a sensation. Go back to 1976 when McCartney came back to America famously. He had the covers of Time and Newsweek. He was the toast of the country for, however many weeks the tour was. It was really quite a remarkable period. I mean, there are books, or at least book, about that tour. So, I think we would have seen something along those lines.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Walking on Thin Ice, because that is a terrific record, and obviously John was quite consumed with that towards his final week and final weeks, given that they were working on that. And I think the thing that's so refreshing about it is that, clearly, obviously, Lennon's death may well have contributed to the chart impact of that record, but John was insistent that he felt that would have been a real smash hit, that would have got to number 1. It is, very unfortunate, because in a way, to me, Walking on Thin Ice sort of indicates that he still had that eye for the cultural zeitgeist, as you put it. That he wanted Yoko to be at the forefront of that new wave era, which, technically speaking, I do feel she could have been. She certainly was a precursor to a lot of those styles, as your book points out about the B-52s and so on.
Absolutely. We have a thing here at my university called Tuesday Night Record Club, and we were talking about the Talking Heads, talking about the Talking Heads. Anyway, some months ago, and it really occurred to me that their sound is so close to what Yoko was doing on Double Fantasy, with songs like Every Man Has a Woman Who Loves Him, and I'm Moving On, and those sorts of tonalities. I mean, obviously Walking on Thin Ice was a major dance hit, but it could have been a crossover, charting single on its own, if not for, again, that cloud. I hope this is not too iconoclastic, but I really think it's just about the best song they do together in their career. And to me, it's even though it is, a Yoko Ono song, it has so much of John's energy in it that I put it way up there with all of the records he makes after the Beatles.
Yeah, quite right. Of course, most Beatles fans know that Lennon famously quit the music business between 76 and 79 to raise his son Sean, obviously the house husband years. In 1980, obviously, your book covers the fact that was his comeback year when he was working on Double Fantasy. With hits like, Just Like Starting Over, Woman, Watching the Wheels, which I think are ranked definitely highly up there amongst all of his solo compositions. How do you think his songwriting in this period indicated how his time away from the music business changed him as a person?
Well, I think we have to contextualize that entire period fairly to him. I think he absolutely had to have this kind of retirement, right? Because this guy was exhausted, and understandably so. The Beatles had taken so much out of all of them. George Harrison liked to say they gave up their nervous systems, right? And they really, really did. And John certainly no less than anyone else. So on top of that, you have a spate of lawsuits he's dealing with, including, perhaps most famously of the many, the immigration fight, which goes on for years, which threatens his livelihood, his ability to stay in his home. He has the birth of an infant in 1975. This guy is working on all fronts, and I think it's understandable for us to think about his his withdrawal for those reasons alone. I mean, he must have been simply exhausted on a whole new spate of levels. I think he works doubly hard on those great songs because he's watching, or rather hearing, the music business changing during that period. I mean, it's right there on the radio, and he had to have felt that shifting and even more competitive energy that was taking place on the musical landscape, particularly as he neared the moment when he felt confident enough to share his work. Hence, those are great works of songs craftsmanship. Wow, I don't know if that you can really without hyphens, but they really are, right? You mentioned Watching the Wheels. He spends, well over a year thinking about that song, if not longer, actually. It went through several iterations, different kinds of rhythms and time signatures. He worked on that thing like a dog to bring it home, and it is, it's a masterpiece. If for only the fact that he says there are no problems, only solutions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely.
So it had everything, and it was, to my mind, it is the best song in the album for all of the hard work he put into it. But, even Starting Over, which I adore, is at least 3 or 4 different song fragments that come together because of his craft in like one singular whole. He was just a master at that. And you can hear that with his Beatles songs too, right? Merging a chorus from another song with a verse of another song and really bringing something special home.
Yeah, I always felt that the longer time that Lennon took working on a composition, such as he did with Strawberry Fields Forever when he was in the Beatles, the stronger the result. And you can definitely see, your book certainly brings to life that process of the fact that he was working on many different iterations of that, fusing together one melodic idea with another to actually come up with the final result. And that's why I do feel that his songwriting on his comeback is definitely up there with his best. Contrary to Lennon's claim, famously, he claimed he never picked up a guitar when he was during his house husband years. Your book makes it quite clear that he never actually stopped writing music, although perhaps more sporadically than he did. For those in the know, obviously there's actually probably about 24 unreleased Lennon songs. I call them songs, but obviously some of them are more completed than others. One of the things your book covers is how he had an ambition to write songs for a proposed musical called The Ballad of John and Yoko. Is that right?
That is, and my publisher, when we were talking about that, they asked to see if there was a libretto, which I think would have been wonderful if we knew, and perhaps Yoko will tell us yet, but in some detail where he planned to go with that, because as you know from reading the book, some of the songs are really out of left field as far as a musical goes, called The Ballad of John and Yoko.
Yeah, I've noted a few of them down here. Obviously I was familiar with them from, I think some of those fragments were released on a Lennon box set, the Lennon anthology set, but there's She Is a Friend of Dorothy's, Sally and Billy. I can't help but feel that despite these songs being unfinished, why don't you think that this material has ever seen greater light of day? Because although it might have been released on that box set, I've always felt that there may well have been more mileage in further Lennon posthumous releases. I think for example, Woody Guthrie, say, when he had a lot of unfinished lyrics, famously the family of Woody Guthrie gave those song ideas to Wilco and Billy Bragg, and they released an album where they completed some of those unfinished works. Why do you think that might not have happened by now? Obviously, it's a long time since his death, and I think that the older that Yoko gets, the less likely it seems that we may see those songs completed by someone, or at least given the sort of free as a bird treatment. What do you think to that?
Well, I think they're quite fascinating. I've listened to so many. I don't know that I've listened to everything, but I sure have tried. Did have that Lost Lennon tape series, right, in the I guess it was the 80s, that Elliot Mentz hosted. So I guess a lot of them, they may feel as though they have released them because they were in that series. I'm not sure, but as we saw from the Escher tapes and how wonderful they sounded when they got a studio varnish on them, while still retaining, their kind of improv nature. from Giles Martin in that box set for the White Album, I would imagine that they would be a fascinating experience if they were to be treated in that fashion. And, I would certainly pay the price of admission, sight unseen and sound unheard. So, I think he and the Beatles, because they are so elevated in the annals of popular music, as they should be, they're the high culture of the genre, that they deserve that kind of treatment. But, it's interesting, as many of the principals are still alive, or at least folks who are protecting their estates. I don't know that the Beatles themselves thought that a lot of this material was worthy in the same way that we do. And particularly today's generation. I have 15, 18, and 20-year-olds or so in my Beatles class, and they are excited and really turned on by the idea of understanding how things work. And I'm right there with them. And having these kinds of materials out there allows us to follow the lineage of how a song is built. And, starting over by itself with those many different fragments that come together is fascinating. And I think that the folks at Apple would be wise to start considering how they can use this material to excite, young fans, and who, by the way, already like the Beatles. The numbers are quite convincing themselves in terms of the amount of streaming that the Beatles enjoy, which is, off the charts. So why not speak to this new generation and indeed earlier ones by sharing this material in a curated fashion so that people can follow along. And it's a natural progression, right? Because, so many people enjoyed Rock Band and these sorts of experiences several years ago. Well, more than several years ago now. And that was a kind of entree for a lot of people into understanding all the component parts of songwriting and the layers of the recording process.
Well, on that point, the Beatles' Love album famously does that with Strawberry Fields Forever, where you can follow it from its genesis through to the final result within the space of one song. I think that, I'm a big fan of what happened with the Free as a Bird demo when the Beatles took hold of it, and I'm not in no way suspecting that much of that Lennon unreleased material could be given the Beatles treatment. Obviously, unfortunately, George is no longer with us, so it wouldn't be the same sort of experience. But I certainly feel personally that, as much as some of those pieces are unfinished, there are people out there who potentially could finish them, like you say, give them a bit of a digital dust down and release them. Famously, Grow Old With Me is a song that was given an orchestral treatment by George Martin as well. When I hear some of those songs, I can't help but feel that Lennon's catalogue isn't full yet, and I think that there should almost be like a Kickstarter thing where someone tries to kind of make something happen with those, because I do like to hear them. So.
If you're listening, Apple, I've long said that I'm sure millions of people would pay a subscription fee every month, and probably a tidy one, if they had access to everything. I don't want to, confess how much I would pay a month, but it is north of $100 for sure to have this kind of access, so that one can explore all of that lineage and history and, or just flat out enjoy the best versions of each song, and I hope they've considered that. I believe, and I may be wrong about this, but I believe Bruce Springsteen's camp has been working for a while to build out this kind of audio archive that will exist. And Paul McCartney's obviously been doing that at a certain level anyway.
Yeah.
But, that's, I think that's the wave of the future. I would be using it every week in class.
Yeah, definitely. McCartney's archive collection often delves deep into some of the outtakes that weren't used on some of his solo material. But there are some songs that Lennon did, I think, that are more complete than others, like "Help Me to Help Myself." That's the sort of song that I think that could easily be given the Free as a Bird treatment, as I recalled it. I want to shift subjects completely now to the Dakota Building, because your book highlights quite a few security flaws in the setup that the Lennons had at the Dakota Building, with many stories of Beatles fans sneaking past the doormen, attempting to gain access to John's apartment. I believe that police were even called on one occasion. Although Lennon was understandably concerned, he still tended to drop his guard down a lot with fans. Though no one, of course, could have predicted that this would eventually have led to his death. Do you think that it was a matter of time before something bad happened to John as a result of the lax security measures?
Well, I don't think that was in the calculus, in the 70s at all. And that's one of the reasons I took really significant pains to try to tell the story of the Dakota and that time, right? So it's very different. It's very different in the life of New York City, which, of course, has made and remade itself several times over since then. It was definitely a different world. And the fear at that time, and there was plenty of evidence that this should have been the concern, was kidnapping, that Sean might be kidnapped by ne'er-do-wells and a significant ransom would be asked. That was the name of the game in the 70s, both in, with wealthy folks and celebrities, but also in air travel. It was the great age, the infamous age of hijacking. So, I think they were responding to that correctly in that way, because they would receive advice, I think even from the FBI at one point, about these sorts of issues. So it's hard to second guess them, because it's like second guessing 9/11, right? Before 9/11 we were pretty sure that if anything bad happened on an airplane, it was going to be hijacking. Still the modus operandi in 2001, or some kind of bomb threat or something that wouldn't be carried out, even though it had already, in fact, that had already happened by then. Anyway, so obviously after 9/11, the idea that someone would use a plane as a missile became very, very real. And obviously after John is murdered, a number of celebrities then changed their security measures. And even still, we famously had the young woman who was in My Sister Sam was murdered in the early 80s, and other sorts of things like that. But I cannot help but hear John's words. If somebody wants to kill you, they'll kill the bodyguard first, then they're going to kill you. Yeah. And I think if you're trying to live in a city and you want that experience, and your entire adult life has been spent losing your privacy because of a kind of superstardom that is, unheard of, right, for most people. I can see how he was trying to live a normal life. And I don't know that at a certain level you can forestall something like that.
No, I completely agree. I think that what does come across, though, somewhat, is that John did obviously take the threat to him and his family's privacy quite seriously, but there are other occasions where obviously he was walking around New York and giving a general hush to people, and he seemed to enjoy the fact that he'd been noticed as well. And I know it's easy to be wise in the benefit of hindsight, but I can't help but read that kind of thing and think that it's almost as though he knew he was famous, but if only he'd have perhaps tried not to bring too much attention to himself in that period.
Two issues then. One, he lived in a doorman building, right, as we like to say. And not only was it it was the ultimate doorman building. It had a fake moat. It looked like a fortress. I'm sure that the building itself gave kind of an odd sense of safety. And I imagine that it was easy to write off, well, another kid got through, but it's just some 12-year-old, and then there was just the sheer fact, and I hope this comes through in the book too, that John clearly loved people.
Yes,
and,
definitely.
He
even invited them in, didn't he? Like two teenage boys. Your book covers the story of them knocking on the door and him inviting them in for juice and talking about life. And
examples of him just enjoying the opportunity to talk to folks. By the same token, he could also be stressed out by being noticed when he was trying to spend some quiet time with Yoko or his family or what have you. But I imagine that's par for the course for anyone nearing that strata of fame. But he genuinely loved people. So I imagine even the signing of the autograph for the worst fan on December 8th, he's checking to see if he got the autograph he want. Is this what you want? I think that really typifies him and a lot of great aspects of him.
Yeah, I think that dichotomy as well between his love of his fans whilst also wanting to maintain his guard to an extent is perhaps like really better exemplified by I want to talk to you about the photographer Paul Gariety. As there are many Lennon fans, particularly on social media, who speak quite fondly of Paul Gariety and the so-called friendship that he made with John. I believe Gariety was quite active on social media in some Facebook groups and sharing a lot of accounts of walks that he'd been on with Lennon. So he was quite open with fans, but he certainly gave the impression that he and John were best buddies. But your book actually tells of how the initial meeting between Lennon and Gariety happened by deception more than anything, and that Gariety posed as a VHS repairman to gain access to John's apartment. So that was all part of a ploy for him to get an autograph, so it seems. And then, of course, later your book covers how Gariety angered Lennon as he was spotted taking photographs secretly of him sort of across the street. So that to me doesn't really sound like a friend. That sounds like a stalker who became to be begrudgingly tolerated by John. And your book does say that eventually they regarded him as harmless, but that he was still somewhat, kept him at arm's length to an extent. Do you think that the friendship that Gariety claims to have had with Lennon was genuine?
That's such a tough one, right? Because you can read it in myriad ways. On the one hand, again, John loved people, and I think he was giving the guy the time of day in a genuine sense. He was thoughtful about Paul Gariety, the way he provided him with the record album, which he knew would matter to a super fan, on the day of the Double Fantasy release, or the way he made sure that when they had Roger Farrington over on August 7th to take the initial studio maiden voyage photos, that Paul got to get his shot too. And in fact, his shot is beautiful, and it adorns the cover of Watching the Wheels. So I think it's hard to discount that evidence that they had come to realize that he was harmless. One could also say that maybe he was just playing politics and making sure that he kept this guy in his corner, which, if Paul was harmless, and everything suggests ultimately he was not, then at least they would have him in a place where they wanted him to be. But, you can't, by all of those tokens, you can't go back and say that what he had done originally was not highly deceptive and stalker-ish, right? The idea of lying in wait, of sneaking into the building under false pretenses. John and Yoko were certainly very forgiving with him in that regard. But, he's really an interesting case in point about this kind of fanishness and celebrity, and an interesting case in point about how, I guess in some ways, John was his worst enemy. John Lennon was his own worst enemy, I meant, because he was so humane and I'm certain quite caring. He would go the extra mile for folks. There's a lovely story that you've also, I'm sure, read about Stu Zolotaro, who is a wonderful photographer, and it was mutual acquaintances with Helen Seaman. And when he needed a photo for his his portfolio, Helen said, "Well, come up and shoot a photo of John and Yoko." And, Stu says, "Okay." And one day he shows up at the door and John comes right down. So they were trusting that Stu was this good guy, which he is, and thankfully still is. They were trusting that Stu was this good guy, and that, he wouldn't have had an army of other photographers out there, or who knows what going on. It's just the Gariety stories are such a good make good cases in point about how we are often our own worst enemies.
Your book also mentions this, but yeah, during the making of Imagine, there was another fan that managed to sort of encounter John Lennon, and they invited him in for food, and tried to talk him down because he seemed to be in very distressed state. So that in itself, you're very correct in that. John Lennon was obviously a very humane person, and I don't deny that. I just thought I'd ask you that question because it's one of those things where when you see people really sort of speak very highly of Goresh, and although his photograph was later used on the cover for Watching the Wheels and things like that, in my head I can't help but think that for every harmless fan that Lennon accepted into the fold, as it were, it unfortunately increased the likelihood of people with slightly more nefarious intentions sort of finding their way in, which unfortunately is what happened. But again, I mean, no one could have predicted that. Nobody likes to believe that anyone is capable of what actually happened in December 1980. But there were things in your book that just certainly just made me think that the security aspect. I mean, there was a newspaper report I think your book refers to, where what the columnist or the writer was saying about how there's loads of locks on their door and stuff, but there actually wasn't. And there's things like that jump out to me that that they were balancing this sense of, yes, we need to maintain our privacy, but at the same time, it wasn't always borne out by some of the decisions that were made. I mean, I'm going to ask a tricky one now. I say tricky. The Radio 1 DJ, Andy Peebles, who interviewed John Lennon in the days before his death, famously set a real ruckus going by sharing some rather nasty comments about Yoko. And I myself, I don't have the antipathy towards Yoko that a lot of people have. But he claims that the depiction of domestic bliss and marital, harmony and even sobriety on Double Fantasy. Although I would doubt sobriety was that, because with songs like Clean Up Time and things like that, it does hint that things weren't entirely clean and spick and span in the Lennon household within that period. Do you feel that Andy Peebles is off base when he says that a lot of the way that album was presented was little more than the publicity stunt, and that Yoko and John's marriage was anything but harmonious at that time?
This is I'm glad you brought this up, because this is kind of what I find interesting ultimately, and that is why people care so much. I see Yoko as a witness to history, and often as I've said earlier, with Walking on Thin Ice and her great work on Double Fantasy, and often a participant, a central participant, right? I don't understand how for some people that translates into some kind of villainhood. It's never made sense to me. In that regard, why these characters become really personal, like they're in some sort of novel or work of fiction. It kind of astounds me, and I don't understand Andy Peebles saying that, because okay, so they used shorthand to explain what their lives had been over the last 5 years, and John didn't want to go into the difficulties he had with writing, or maybe just exhaustion or even depression. Why would he want to do that on a publicity tour, right? We've seen so much PR in our lifetimes. I find that to be problematic from Andy, who otherwise, of course, hosted a very valuable interview in the life story of John and Yoko, and certainly John in his final days, if not hours. You could start counting the hours at that point. I don't understand why he has to use that as, some kind of story. What marriage really is, what you see, today on Facebook, right? Or the way people present themselves. I just think that's disingenuous. They were using shorthand. It always reminds me, I've been studying a lot about John's early life lately, and After a while, he got so tired of having to try to explain, even when he wasn't even 10 years old, why he lived with his aunt and where was his mother.
Mm.
Imagine that for a moment, always having to try to explain that to other kids, your peer group. And he would come up with shorthand ways to deal with it because it was so painful. Where's your mom? Are you a bastard? I'm sure he got all sorts of garbage like that, right? Why are you living with your auntie? And I think that they commonly use shorthand throughout their public lives to try to explain how they got to certain places. So what was John doing? Okay, maybe he only baked bread once. So what? We have lots of eyewitness testimony that he did have a wonderful relationship with Sean, and that he and Yoko had a tender side to them. And what I like about the end of their relationship, which unfortunately is caused by, assassination, I like who they've morphed into. They're in their 12th year of marriage. They had a large interruption, as lots of marriages do, right? Earlier in the decade, when John was on the Lost Weekend, and they had to be apart for a while for very good reasons, very stressful ones. And yet there they are, being, whatever else they were, whatever was real or not real. I don't care. But what I do like is how they were each other's cheerleader, and how hard they worked for each other. And we can see it so visibly because they went on that media blitz. You have them talking to David Geffen. I love that the twin stories that Geffen tells about, John coming up to her and him and saying, we really need to make this album work for Yoko. And then Yoko will take him aside, this is really important to John. And just how they function as each other's cheerleaders. Who wouldn't want that in a marriage, right? I mean, that's a beautiful kind of partnership. And even if it's not about, platinum records and making, notches on the Billboard charts, it could just be about being each other's cheerleader, in real life and supporting each other. So yeah. I know I'm going off kind of long-windedly here, but I find that to be just strange behavior that in 2020, and you see it, you can find it every day.
There was a recent story about, I believe, Fred Seaman, is it Fred Seaman? I don't know. There was somebody who's given a talk, even though he swore not to, and has recently been hit with a lawsuit by Yoko for breaching his agreement. So you still see it surface even now, all these years later. These people who come out of the woodwork and try and reinterpret history. Well,
and that's such a great case in point. I've seen some of the commentary online about that, and when you start reading into the comments, it's interesting. It's like sports. People have taken sides. There'll be folks like defending Fred, folks attacking Fred, folks defending Yoko, folks really attacking Yoko. And you have to think to yourself at a certain point, wow. I mean, it's like, you're rooting for Liverpool FC or you're rooting against them, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's true.
Kind of politics, where our political figures have become like these, opponents in the ring.
Well, whatever people's stance on Yoko, I mean, I think personally what becomes very clear to me through reading the history of John and watching videos and everything is, Yoko was really central to a lot of the artistic vision, really, behind how John presented himself a lot of the time. I mean, Imagine, obviously, famously, he claimed that she should have had a songwriting credit on that because of how recurrent that word was in her book, Grapefruit, and even the white iconography and everything. To me, that's purely based on Yoko's conceptual art exhibitions in the 60s. So, I'm a firm believer in that everything happens for a reason, and that, you should maintain quite an objective view on the role that Yoko played. And clearly, she meant a lot to John. And I think that, unfortunately, that does tend to get forgotten by many fans.
He actually gave us, in a comment, I believe, to Larry Kane, some very useful wisdom about him and his choices. And that was when he was talking, this is after the Lost Weekend, and he said, I was with this wonderful woman and I made a lot of great music. And I often see that quoted, but the next part is the part that matters. And he says, but I belong here with my wife. And it was clear that that was his choice, and whether all of these people who are taking sides in the in the blogosphere or whatever you want to call, the internet and cyberspace, the guy that they're worshiping at some level, it's like they're not even taking his own testimony into account.
Agreed, yeah. Okay, so I've read somewhere that you are the producer of a documentary which is currently in the works, John Lennon, The Final Year. Are you able to give us an update on how that's going and when the film may be released? Am I right in thinking you're a producer on that?
You are not right.
Ah, okay.
Yes, that was a story maybe a year or so ago. There was a firm, a production team I was working with, but that process is no longer in vogue. And
that's
hasn't been
unfortunate.
for a long time.
Very unfortunate, because I mean,
Yeah.
your book is shows definitely how it would merit a really good documentary about that subject. And given that it's his 80th year, I am trawling to see if there's anything new that's come out. I believe recently the BBC did some interviews between Sean Lennon and Paul McCartney, especially for John's 80th. But that's pretty much all I've seen so far in the way of new documentaries or the like. So yeah, that's a shame.
The one I would like, I don't know that there'd be a market for, and that is one where, because John went to all of these fascinating places in his last year, both with or without Yoko, when he would go on the directional trips, I think sort of walking in those footsteps would be interesting.
Yeah, travelogue. Yeah, that would be really good actually, because he did do a lot of traveling in those years, which your book does cover. So yeah, that would be good. I would like to see that. Okay, yeah, well, sorry for the mistake there. Like I say, I did read somewhere that it was in the pipeline and your name was affixed to it. So it's a shame because, like I say, that would have been something to look forward to. I did kind of think.
I don't know that we ever came out with the story suggesting otherwise. And apparently Sky TV has gone in another direction and they have a different kind of documentary coming out toward the end of the year. So.
Okay. I mean, obviously with lockdown and everything, it's delayed lots of films and things like that. So I was just curious as to whether that might be why nothing's been heard about it, but we have an answer. So
that's as good a reason as any to be happy that it didn't go forward. Although there are other good reasons to understand why it didn't go forward. But the lockdown and our pandemic have it's thrown such a wrench into the vicissitudes of real life.
Definitely. Okay, my final question now is: there is a moment in a book where John Lennon expresses surprise that a student was studying the Beatles in school or in university. What do you think it is about the Beatles and John Lennon in particular, which has become pretty much an academic pursuit for many of us and continues to inspire such adulation?
Because the Beatles songs have the necessary depth and emotional power, and that we are able to study them, right? I mean, they exist as pieces of music, but they also exist as recordings, and it's useful. For example, I believe in my class that I teach here at Monmouth University, I believe it's valuable because it helps students to think about appreciating art in general. There's no terminology, for example, that I use in thinking about the Beatles that they can't go and apply to watching, I don't know, Mad Men, right? Or Casablanca, or reading a book like Jane Eyre. I mean, it's just, it's a portable technology. And it's valuable to think deeply about the things we love. Why? What is it? What is the machinery in there that has me coming back and back again to this song or this album? Those sorts of things were in their infancy when John died. But now, there are courses on Harry Potter. And I don't mean that to denigrate Harry Potter. I believe that's important work to understand what it is we're doing when we have the reading experience with those J.K. Rowling books. What is it that makes it valuable, and how can we create more wonderful stories and music, etc.?
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for your time, Kenneth. It was really good to chat with you. I think we covered quite a lot of ground. I certainly prepared enough questions for it, and I thought I might have prepared too many, so I'm glad we covered them all. I strongly encourage anyone who is watching this video to go out and buy a copy of John Lennon 1980, The Last Days in the Life by Kenneth Womack. It is a terrific book, and it's extremely insightful if you're a fan of Lennon and you want some information about the last year of his life and who he was as a person at that particular time. The world, unfortunately, was robbed of an enormous talent that year, and the book truly reminds us why in as unsalacious a way as possible, which is absolutely necessary, because as you said, Kenneth, there are so many books out there that focus on the gory details. I don't see a single day on my Lennon Facebook groups where I don't see the worst possible pictures you could see of John Lennon, and it's good to have a book that really kind of covers the human story, the story of the actual real man.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Luke, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, and keep up the good work.
Great. Thank you for joining me. Okay, thanks for watching, everyone. Bye.